Okay, New Testament survey. We are taking a quick look at the Gospel of John today. Now, a lot of scholars date this somewhere between 80 and 110 AD or CE, excuse me. There's a theory that the main composer wrote the body of the Gospel of John in the 90s, and a redactor put some additions in around 100 or 110 AD or CE. And when I say redactor, somebody that added to it, I guess you could say, is another way to do that. Somebody that maybe edited it a little better, or a little differently, I should say. The traditional author, is said to be John, one of the sons of Zebedee, one of the original disciples, one of the 12. John is not mentioned in any of the narratives in the Gospel of John, and the sons of Zebedee are only mentioned in 21:2. The author is often thought to be that of the beloved disciple, who's mentioned in the text in one tradition, or one in that tradition, I should say. It's believed that the author or redactor were from the same Johannine tradition or Johannine school. It's maybe a group of disciples, a Christian community deeply influenced by or from the product of the teachings of the beloved disciple. Raymond Brown's written a good bit on this, deceased Catholic scholar. The author appears to be familiar with Palestine, knows the location of Bethany in 1118, the garden across from Kidron in 18:1, Solomon's porch and the temple in 1023, the pools of Bethesda, in 5:2, the pool of Siloam in 9:7. The author also appears to be familiar with Judaism's teachings, such as the feast and the theology behind them, 5:9, chapter 5 verse 9, chapter 7 verse 2, chapter 10 verse 22, and the Jewish customs, purity regulations, such as chapter 2 verse 6, 18 verse 28, and the Paschal Lamb in 19 verse 36. Now, as far as a place of writing, traditionally and plausibly Ephesus is the area of the writing, but some do suggest Syria. The location of Ephesus is doubted because Bishop Ignatius of Antioch, in a writing to the congregation of Ephesus before 120 AD, talks much about Paul's residence in the city while not mentioning John at all. Although there is a tomb of John in Ephesus, and it's been venerated since the 3rd century CE or AD, excuse me. Now, as far as is the work unified, was it all from one pen? Some think sources, like a collection of signs, a collection of discourses, a passion narrative, were combined later. Others think there were several editions. Either case, plausibly the Gospel of John was created by one writer, and maybe someone added in some sections in later editions, such as chapter 21 or chapters 1 verses 1 through 18, the introduction, the prologue. But no text of the Gospel of John has been preserved without these additions. There is one little caveat about the story. There's a story of the woman caught in adultery in chapter 7, verse 53 through 8:11 that may be an insertion into the text of the Gospel of John. And some of the oldest, most reliable manuscripts, copies, I should say, of the Gospel of John, that story is not there. And you'll find footnotes in modern Bibles mentioning that. Now, as far as the structure goes, you'll notice on the right side of the screen here a general thematic outline. And this is from the Anchor Bible. It's a good older commentary. This volume was written by Raymond Brown, one of the four preeminent scholars of the Gospel of John in the last 100 years. But notice that there's at least two main sections. There's a prologue and there's an epilogue. There are two main sections of the Book of Signs and the Book of Glory. Notice the description of the Book of Signs says, the public ministry of Jesus, where in sign and word he showed himself to his own people, as a revelation of his Father, only to be rejected. One of the things you'll find in the Gospel of John is Jesus does these things. They're not called miracles. They're called signs. And it essentially is pointing to the Father in some way, pointing to this Father. Now, the Book of Glory, to those who accept him, Jesus shows his glory by returning to the Father in the hour of his crucifixion, resurrection, ascension. Fully glorified, he communicates the Spirit of life. So there's this two-part section of the Book of John. Now, in relation to the Synoptic Gospels, in a broad stroke, Synoptics have been called more historical, and John's been called more theological, with its high Christology. Christology is the study, literally the study or a word about Christ. If it makes you feel more comfortable, the literary term characterization may come into play here. That Jesus has a higher Christology. He's more characterized as more like God in the Gospel of John as opposed to the Synoptic Gospels. And there's about a dozen differences or so, or a handful more differences between the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John. Like I said earlier, miracles, things that are portrayed as miracles in the Synoptic Gospels are called signs in the Gospel of John. There is some tension in the Gospel of John between Jesus and the Jewish leaders of his day. And there's a reference to the Jewish people as the Jews, and it's a very pejorative type term here. In fact, there's an example over in chapter 9, verse 28. It says, the Pharisees are talking here, I believe. You are his disciples, but we are disciples of Moses. See, the Pharisees survived the aftermath of temple destruction and prospered and turned the shape of post-war Judaism. In the final decades of the first century, the equation of the Pharisees and Jews would have been understandable. So there's this notion, you'll find this phrase, the Jews, being a negative term used against the Judaism of the writer's day. In other words, just like we found in Matthew, the tension against the Pharisees, and in possibly the audience to whom Matthew is writing, or the Matthean writer lived in, we find there is tension between the gospel writer, John, goodness gracious, not enough caffeine today, and the Jewish people or the leaders of his day. So remember, sometimes, just like when I go back to The Crucible, the Arthur Miller play, sometimes there's the story behind the text says more about the story of the text. The Raymond Brown world behind the text, world of the text, world before the text. Sometimes the world behind the text says more about, the world of the text is in play too. Excuse me. Now, notice there's also some possible connections between the Gospel of John and Hellenism, which is the Greek culture. We find in chapter 1 the word, this divine logos. The term logos is used a great deal in the Gospel of John, and it's very important, at least because it begins the book. In the beginning was the Word, words with God, the Word was God. And again, chapter 1 points back to high Christology. It points back to this divine logos. But the word logos itself has deep roots in Greek philosophy, especially in Stoicism and Neoplatonism. It's doubtful that John may have known the philosophical writings of Neoplatonism or Stoicism, but he may have breathed some of the same atmosphere of this philosophy, kind of pop philosophy of his day, maybe. Some other Jewish writings from Hellenistic perspective, such as writings of Philo, the Wisdom of Solomon, are informed by this notion of divine logos, this prevalent Greek philosophy. For example, for Philo, the divine logos was important as a principle between the mediation between God and the world, an intermediary, which is something we see going on a little bit in the Gospel of John. But the Gospel of John also has some connections to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran community. And until the discovery of the Qumran Scrolls, most scholars saw little connection between the thought of John and the thought of the first century Judaism. John was often linked more to a Hellenistic perspective than as opposed to a Jewish perspective. But there are some parallels between John and the Dead Sea Scrolls, whereas before the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, dualism in John was attributed to Platonism or Neoplatonism influence. But John and the Scrolls share dualistic concepts of light, darkness, above, below, true, false. The sons of darkness, the sons of light is very prevalent in some of the sectarian manuscripts of the Dead Sea Scroll community. So there's precedent in Palestinian Judaism for the thought world of John. So it's not just a Greek-informed document. Um, let's talk a little bit more about this Christology, this word. Though it has its roots in Stoicism, this logos, this word, like I found in chapter 1, appears to be associated with wisdom in Jewish thought. The primary, and this is a quote here, this is from Alan Culpeper, the primary source of John's confession that Jesus was the Logos is probably reflection on the wisdom tradition of Israel. She, this personified wisdom, existed before the world was created, and she was God's agent in creation. Wisdom's linked with light in Wisdom of Solomon 7:10, 7:26, 7:29. Descended from the heavens and above, and related to earthly things. Think Proverbs 8:31, Sirach 24:8, which Sirach and Wisdom of Solomon are New Testament documents. In John, the Logos, or Jesus, has power over creation. Chapter 1, verse 3. The Logos multiplies bread and fish and walks on water. And that's kind of a reference, it kind of plays off of Job 9:8, Psalm 77:16, and 77:19. Jesus healing the blind man by using clay in 9:6 seems to be an allusion to Genesis 2, where the man was formed from earth. And of course, we looked at earlier in one of the other lectures that in the beginning was the Word, parallels Genesis 1, Genesis 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And now it's finally decided to pop up. Well, of course, the Common English says when God began to create. It's a little different, but Bereshit bara can be understood in two different manners. But I think NIV has in the beginning. So there is that play off of those. And go back to lecture 1 if you want to see the comparison side by side of John 1:1 and Genesis 1:1. But there's parallels there. Now, another notion we find in John needs to be further explored besides Christology, the Word, is this notion of the revealer. Jesus is a revealer. He is presented as one who reveals the Father or points toward the Father. Got John 1:18. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. That is very important in the Gospel of John. The emphasis in the prologue is on revelation as opposed to atonement. Notice verse 4, verse 9, 12, 14, 17. Verse 4, in him was life, and light was the light of all people, and of course light shines in darkness. Light shines in darkness. There's a dark-light dichotomy that we find also in Qumran scrolls. Another aspect of Christology, Jesus is a redeemer. There's a strong emphasis on Jesus as a redeemer in contrast to the ruler of the world, a very dualistic concept. Chapter 12, verse 31. If I can pull that up there. I need to get a faster computer processor. There you go. My little Surface tablet, the hamster inside the wheel's turning. Now is the judgment of this world. Now the rule of the world will be driven out. So this rule of the world, this current dark age, and a future light age. That's very much in line with what we see in the Qumran scrolls, Dead Sea Scrolls. Jesus promised real freedom to the children of Abraham who thought they were already free. Chapter 8, 31 through 32. Another aspect of Christology is this notion of Son. The word Son appears 18 times in John. Son of God 9 times. Son of Man 13 times. Jesus is the only begotten Son, the monogenes, in chapter 1. And let me go back there. The only begotten or Son there, the monogenes, in John chapter 1, verse 14. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, the incarnation. Which, by the way, Matthew and Luke have birth narratives. Mark has nothing. John has this grandiose, high Christology. The Word became flesh, the incarnation. We've seen His glory as the glory of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. So this only begotten, Father's only Son. This notion of monogenes, or only begotten, at verse 18. 3:16, chapter 3, verse 16 is a very famous story. In fact, if you ever memorize any scripture, John 3:16 is probably one of the few places you have memorized, or about everybody and has some exposure to church is memorized. For God so loved the world, he gave his only Son, monogenes, the Greek term there, so that everyone who believes in him may not perish but have eternal life. Here's a, let's see here, trying to see my notes. Well, over at 828, well, let's see, doing the will, chapter 4, doing the will of the Father, Jesus' food. All who come to Jesus are given by the Father, chapter 6, 37, 6, 44, and 6, 65. Jesus says only what the Father has taught him, 828. So this notion of dependence upon this God the Son as God the Father, and I'm, the notion of Trinity gets some of its roots from the Gospel of John here, more so than other Gospels. Let's look at the I am sayings over in, let's see here, Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. And it's going to come up here eventually. And God said to Moses, I am who I am. Okay. So the I am sayings, and this is the chapter 3 is the burning bush scene, if you remember the Old Testament, where God reveals himself to Moses in a burning bush. What's your name? And God says, I am who I am. Let me pull up the Hebrew here, if it'll come. Let's see. I am who I am. There's a quote there. And God said to Moses, I am who I am. In that, let's see here, this part of the word, hey, yod, hey, you read from right to left in Hebrew. That root is the word, that's the word to be. The aleph there looks like an X. That is, let's know it's first person. But this yod, hey, or excuse me, this hey, yod, hey, this verb to be is possible where the name Yahweh, Yod, Hey, Vav, Hey, or Adonai comes from, that the sacred Jewish name for God that appears a few times in the Old Testament. It's written in Paleoscript in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls documents. But I am who I am. I am sent you. This divine name appears in the Septuagint, in Isaiah 43:25, Isaiah 51:12. This name I am. In John, this phrase I am is a reference to, Jesus uses it himself several times. He uses it sometimes without a predicate nominative, like I am. Other times he uses it with a predicate nominative. I am X. I am bread of life. So let's look at some of these. Let's look over in chapter 6 of John. There's one in chapter 4:26 where Jesus says I am. But John 6:20, and also in this chapter we'll find a predicate nominative too. But he said to them, it is I. In other words, I am. Do not be afraid. And this is where they're in a boat. They're terrified, and Jesus reveals himself to disciples, and he's like, I am. I'm God. In other words, he's saying that I am. When Jesus says I am, or I am this, or I am that, it points back, or it's an allusion to, at least in the gospel writer's mind here, I think, and in our mind too, it's an allusion back to the Old Testament and this sacred name of God, this I am. Here's some examples of I am without a predicate nominative. Chapter 4, verse 26, chapter 6, verse 20, chapter 8, verse 24, chapter 8, verse 28, chapter 8, verse 58, chapter 13, verse 19, and chapter 18, verse 5, and chapter 18, verse 7. But the more famous instances of I am in John are the ones with a predicate nominative, where the helping verb, the linking verb I am or am, has an action, has a nominative behind it. And one good example is in 6:35. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. Excuse me. Again, I need more coffee. But I am the bread of life. Chapter 6, verse 51, Jesus says he's the living bread of heaven. Chapter 8, verse 12. Again, Jesus spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, will have light, the light of life. I am light. Again, that light, dark contrast. Chapter 9, verse 5, we find the same type of light. I am the light. Nope, I hope I typed the right thing. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. This, again, this light-dark dichotomy, very prevalent in John, but Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Chapter 10, 7 and 9, I am the gate of the sheep. Chapter 10, verse 11 and 14, I am the good shepherd. Chapter 11, verse 25 through 26, I am the resurrection and the life. Chapter 14, verse 6 is a rather famous verse, and this is used very much so by evangelicals to say that Jesus is the only way to God. There's no other way of salvation. Jesus said to him, I am the way, which, by the way, early Christians really didn't call themselves Christians. That was a derogatory term. They're picked on, called Christians, little Christ. They referred themselves usually as the way. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me, which those terms, way, truth, and life, are very theologically loaded, and loaded for the Greco-Roman context as well. Be a good paper to write for you guys one of these days, or some Bible study. Break apart those terms, what those terms mean. Chapter 15, verses 1 and verse 5, Jesus refers to himself as I am the true vine. So we have all these I am sayings in the Old Testament, in John, point back to the Old Testament, where God's divine name, this Yod He Vav He, Yahweh, or a good Jewish reverent person would say Adonai, the Yod He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton, sacred name of God. Now, there's five passages in the farewell discourse, that speak of the promise of a paraclete. Parakaleo, paraclete. In Greek, essentially, one's called alongside, is what that term paraclete means, essentially, the Spirit of truth. And we find in chapter 14, verse 16 through 17 here, if you love me, you will keep my commandments, and I'll ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to be with you forever. And let's see here. And then notice that the helper is also there. A paraclete in the Greco-Roman context is pretty much like an advocate standing along beside of you, almost like a maybe a defense attorney or an ombudsman or something. The Holy Spirit is what's referred to here in 14, over in verse 26 as well, chapter 15, verse 26, chapter 16, and there's the Greek parakletos. Is the noun form, an advocate, advocatus in the Latin, one who appears along somebody's behalf, a mediator, intercessor, helper. Even refers over, which, by the way, there's some Johannine writings, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, and even Revelation. These texts seem to flow out of the same community, some of the same trains of thought, although there's differences going on there, but there seems some similar thought there. This paraclete is mentioned, like I said, chapter 14, verse 15, or chapter 15, verse 26, chapter 16, verses 7 through 11, chapter 16, 13 through 14, and there's some hints in 7 and hints in 20 of this paraclete. And again, I mentioned that the paraclete comes from the Greek word parakletos. Essentially, there's the verb kaleo, called, and then para alongside. Comforter, an advocate, legal connotation.